Gabriel, a financially struggling taxi driver and single father, is drowning in a $10,000 debt he took for his late wife's surgery. With bills piling up, his car payment due, and his daughter hoping to enroll in college, he is at his breaking point. One fateful night, he meets an elderly, tall and imposing black man who appears strangely out of place. As we dive more into this fascinating story, we love to know where you are watching from by telling us in the comments section below. Gabriel sat behind the wheel of his taxi, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the dashboard clock. 11:37 p.m. He sighed. Another long, exhausting day, yet not nearly enough money to cover what he owed. His car payment was due tomorrow, and if he missed it, the company could repossess the vehicle. That was just one of many problems. The bank had been calling him nonstop about his $10,000 loan, and worst of all, his eldest daughter Samantha had been accepted into college, but there was no way he could afford her tuition. His life had become a never-ending cycle of stress, regret, and exhaustion. Gabriel adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of himself. Tired eyes, wrinkled forehead, unshaven face. He barely recognized the man staring back. Things hadn't always been this way. Before, there was hope. Before, there was her. His wife, Maria. She had been his light, the one who reminded him that kindness was never a debt, that giving without expecting was the purest form of love. Even in their worst times, she had a way of making things feel less heavy. But she was gone now, and Gabriel was left carrying everything alone. A knock on the passenger side window startled him. Gabriel turned his head, blinking at the figure outside. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dark-skinned, with a face full of wrinkles and deep, thoughtful eyes. He wore an old brown coat, buttoned up against the night chill, and a black hat that shadowed part of his face. There was something strange about him, something that made Gabriel hesitate before rolling down the window. "Sir," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "I need a ride home." Gabriel let out a tired breath. "Where to?" "Denver." Gabriel frowned. "Denver? As in Denver, Colorado?" "Yes, son." Gabriel nearly laughed. "That's an 11-hour drive. You do realize that, right?" The old man nodded, completely unfazed. "I do. But I don't have any money to pay you. I just need to get home." Gabriel scoffed and shook his head. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I have my own problems. My car payment is due, I'm drowning in debt, and I can't afford to waste an entire night driving for free." He turned his gaze forward, hoping the man would take the hint and walk away. But he didn't. "I understand," the old man said softly. "Life's been hard on you, hasn't it?" Gabriel clenched his jaw. "You have no idea." The man let out a deep sigh, placing his hands on the doorframe. "All I can tell you, son, is that this is important. More important than you know. I just need to get home." Gabriel shook his head again. "I can't help you, sir." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting shadows across the parking lot. The old man's eyes held something Gabriel couldn't quite place. Sadness? Desperation? Or was it something else entirely? Then, just as Gabriel was about to start the car and drive off, a memory flashed through his mind. Maria. He remembered her face, her soft voice, her unwavering kindness. "Help, even when it's hard," she had always said. "Because you never know when kindness will find its way back to you." Gabriel exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. He didn't have time for this. He didn't have the money. But Maria wouldn't have turned this man away. "Denver, huh?" he muttered. The old man nodded. Gabriel sighed, rubbing his temples. "You do realize this is insane, right? 11 hours. That's almost half a day. And you have nothing to offer me in return?" The man's lips curved slightly. "Nothing but my gratitude." Gabriel shook his head. "This is ridiculous." Yet, even as he said the words, he reached for the gear shift. "Get in before I change my mind." The old man nodded in thanks and stepped inside, closing the door gently. As Gabriel pulled out of the parking lot and onto the highway, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that this was more than just a late-night favor. That somehow, in ways he didn't yet understand, this drive would change everything. The road stretched endlessly before them, illuminated only by the glow of Gabriel's headlights and the occasional street lamp. The hum of the tires against the pavement filled the silence between them, broken only by the occasional sigh from Gabriel. He still couldn't believe he was doing this. 11 hours. That was half a day he could have spent picking up paying customers, hustling to cover his bills. Instead, he was driving a total stranger across state lines for free. What the hell am I thinking? Gabriel stole a glance at his passenger. The old man sat quietly in the seat beside him, his large hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. "So," Gabriel said after a long pause, "what's your deal?" The old man turned his head slightly. "My deal? Yeah. Why are you out here in Texas with no money? How'd you even get stranded in the first place?" The old man exhaled deeply, gazing out the window. "It's a long story." Gabriel huffed. "We've got 11 hours. I'd say we have time." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he remained still, watching the passing scenery as if lost in thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I had to take care of something important. Something I should have done a long time ago." Gabriel frowned. "Care to be a little less cryptic?" The old man chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "Patience, son. Everything will make sense soon." Gabriel sighed. "Right. Because that doesn't sound ominous at all." Another long silence filled the car. Gabriel tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, frustration creeping into his chest. He hated secrets. "You at least got a name?" Gabriel finally asked. The old man turned to him, his deep-set eyes locking onto Gabriel's. For a moment, Gabriel felt an odd chill run down his spine. "You can call me Charles." Gabriel nodded. "All right, Charles. You got any family waiting for you in Denver?" Charles's expression darkened. "Not anymore." Something about the way he said it made Gabriel's stomach twist. He knew that pain. That emptiness. It was the sound of loss. Gabriel let out a slow breath, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "Sorry to hear that." "Thank you, son." They drove in silence for a while after that. The highway stretched on, the darkness outside swallowing everything beyond the reach of the headlights. An hour passed. Then another. Gabriel fought against the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. It had been a long day, and now he was pulling an all-nighter for a man he barely knew. He flicked on the radio, hoping to keep himself awake. Static. With a grunt, he turned the dial, searching for a station. The speakers crackled before settling on an old blues song, the kind of tune that made you feel things you weren't ready to confront. Charles let out a quiet hum, nodding his head to the rhythm. "You like blues?" Gabriel asked. "Reminds me of home," Charles murmured. Gabriel glanced at him. "That where you're from? Denver?" Charles smiled faintly. "You could say that." Gabriel furrowed his brows. "You either are or you aren't." Charles chuckled but didn't answer. Gabriel sighed, shaking his head. "Man, you really don't like giving straight answers, do you?" Another chuckle. "Sometimes the truth is best revealed at the right moment." Gabriel rolled his eyes. "Great. Now you sound like my old high school teacher." They continued down the road, the conversation fading once again into silence. The eerie sense of familiarity Gabriel had felt earlier only grew stronger. There was something about Charles, his voice, his mannerisms, that tugged at Gabriel's memory. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place it. Then, somewhere around the 4th hour of their drive, Gabriel caught something strange in the rearview mirror. A flash of movement. His eyes flicked to the road behind them. Empty. He shook his head. Must be exhaustion messing with me. But then, a few minutes later, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just movement, it was a shadow. Something dark flickering along the edges of his vision, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Gabriel's grip on the wheel tightened. "You see that?" Charles remained still. "See what?" "In the mirror. I keep seeing something." Charles exhaled softly. "Don't worry about it." Gabriel's pulse quickened. "Don't worry about it?" That's not exactly comforting, Charles. Charles turned his head, his expression unreadable. Just keep driving, son. Gabriel wanted to press for more answers, but something in Charles's voice told him to drop it. They drove on. The uneasy feeling in Gabriel's chest didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. Something about this whole trip felt unnatural. And deep down, Gabriel knew this was no ordinary passenger. The long stretch of highway seemed endless, the night growing darker with every passing mile. Gabriel rubbed his eyes, exhaustion creeping in, but the unsettling feeling in his chest kept him wide awake. Something about this trip felt wrong, unnatural, even. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. Nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. Charles, however, remained calm. His massive hands were folded neatly in his lap, his eyes staring straight ahead as if he had all the time in the world. Gabriel exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel tighter. He needed answers. "All right, Charles," Gabriel started, keeping his voice steady. "I've been real patient. But something about you ain't sitting right with me. You show up out of nowhere, ask for an 11-hour ride with no money, and act like it's no big deal. Now I'm seeing shadows in my mirror, and you're telling me to just keep driving. What's going on?" Charles let out a slow breath, as if considering his words carefully. "I told you, son. It's a long story." Gabriel scoffed. "Yeah, and I told you we got time." Silence. Then, Charles spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Do you believe in destiny?" Gabriel frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one," Charles replied. "Do you believe that certain moments in life happen for a reason? That no matter what we do, some paths are meant to cross?" Gabriel didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know what he believed anymore. "Look, man, I don't have time for philosophical riddles. Just tell me what's going on." Charles turned his head slightly, his deep-set eyes locking onto Gabriel's. "I've been looking for you, son." A chill ran down Gabriel's spine. He let out a nervous chuckle. "Looking for me? Now I know you're messing with me. We've never met before." Charles tilted his head. "Haven't we?" Gabriel furrowed his brows. "No, we haven't. I think I'd remember a guy like you." Charles sighed, looking out the window again. "Memories are strange things, Gabriel. Sometimes, we bury the ones that hurt the most, but they always find their way back." Gabriel felt his pulse quicken. "How do you know my name?" Charles didn't answer. Gabriel's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't like this. Not one bit. Then, suddenly, a flash of movement. This time, it wasn't just in the mirror. Something darted across the road right in front of the car. Gabriel cursed and yanked the wheel, the tires screeching as the taxi swerved violently to the side. His heart pounded as he struggled to regain control, barely managing to keep the car from crashing into a ditch. The vehicle came to a stop. Silence. Gabriel's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. His hands trembled on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" he barked, turning to Charles. But Charles just sat there, calm as ever. Gabriel's chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked back at the road, expecting to see a deer or some other animal. But there was nothing. No movement. No footprints. Just an empty stretch of highway. Gabriel swallowed hard. He turned back to Charles, his voice unsteady. "You saw that, right?" Charles exhaled slowly. "You're starting to see now, aren't you?" Gabriel shook his head. "See what?" "There was something in the road. It ran right in front of us." Charles nodded. "You're right. But it wasn't something. It was someone." Gabriel blinked. His pulse thundered in his ears. "What?" Charles turned to him fully now, his expression unreadable. "I think it's time I told you the truth, son." Gabriel's stomach twisted into knots. "What truth?" Charles's deep voice was softer now, almost sad. "You saved my life once, Gabriel." Gabriel frowned. "What are you talking about? I don't even know you." "You did once." Charles leaned forward slightly, his large frame casting shadows across the dimly lit car. "It was a long time ago. You were younger. Driving late at night. You saw a terrible accident on the road. A car flipped over, crushed like paper. A family trapped inside. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. The memory came rushing back. A night long ago, a burning car, screams for help. He had been driving home from work when he saw the wreck. Without thinking, he had pulled over and rushed to help. He had pulled an elderly man out first, his hands bloody, his heart racing. He had tried to save the others, tried so hard. But only one had survived. The old man. Gabriel's chest tightened. No. Charles nodded slowly. Yes, son. That man was me. Gabriel felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. But that was years ago. Gabriel's voice trembled. I never saw you again. I tried to follow up, but the hospital said you disappeared. They said you left without a trace. Charles gave him a small, sorrowful smile. Because I wasn't meant to stay. Gabriel's blood ran cold. What are you saying? Charles's eyes darkened, his voice heavy. I died, Gabriel. The world seemed to tilt. The breath hitched in Gabriel's throat. His hands went numb. He looked at Charles, really looked at him, and for the first time he noticed the slight transparency of his skin. The way the streetlights didn't quite reflect in his eyes. The unnatural stillness of his movements. Gabriel's heart pounded. No, that's not possible. You're here. You're sitting in my car. That's not. I couldn't rest, Charles interrupted gently. Not until I found you. Not until I kept my promise. Gabriel's breaths came in quick, shallow gasps. His entire world felt like it was crumbling. I don't understand, he whispered. Charles placed a firm but gentle hand on Gabriel's shoulder. You will. Gabriel swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He didn't know what was happening, if he was dreaming, if he was losing his mind. But deep down, in the depths of his soul, he knew one thing for certain. This was real. And nothing would ever be the same again. Gabriel sat frozen in his seat, the weight of Charles's words sinking into his bones like ice. I died, Gabriel. No matter how many times he replayed those words in his mind, they made no sense. Charles was sitting right there. Breathing. Talking. Real. And yet, as Gabriel stared at him, the truth began to settle in. Charles wasn't like any man he had ever met. His presence felt different, off in a way that Gabriel couldn't explain. His mind screamed at him to deny it, to come up with some rational excuse. Maybe this was exhaustion playing tricks on him. Maybe he was hallucinating. But deep down, he knew better. His hands trembled on the wheel as he forced himself to speak. How is this possible? Charles exhaled, his gaze distant. Some debts are never repaid in life, son. Some promises follow us even in death. Gabriel swallowed hard. You said I saved you that night. Charles nodded. You did. When my car crashed, I was trapped inside, bleeding, slipping away. You didn't hesitate. You pulled me out, carried me in your arms like I weighed nothing, and rushed me to the hospital. Gabriel closed his eyes, the memory flooding back in sharp, vivid detail. He remembered the thick smell of gasoline, the shattered windshield, the eerie silence before the screams began. I tried to save the others, Gabriel whispered. Charles's face darkened with sorrow. I know. Gabriel's jaw clenched. I couldn't. They were already gone when I got there. Charles nodded solemnly. You did everything you could. Gabriel's chest ached. He had never been able to shake that night. It had haunted him for years, the weight of those lives lost, the feeling of helplessness despite his best efforts. But you survived, Gabriel muttered. I thought you survived. Charles smiled faintly. For a little while, I did. But fate had other plans. I wasn't meant to stay, Gabriel. Gabriel's stomach twisted. Then why are you here now? Charles's eyes locked onto his, deep and knowing. Because you need help, son. And I made a promise that even death couldn't break. Gabriel shook his head, gripping his temples. This is insane. This isn't real. Charles chuckled, the sound deep and warm. You always were stubborn. Gabriel let out a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. So what, you're here to, what? Thank me. Charles leaned forward, his voice firm. "I'm here to give you what you've always deserved." Gabriel frowned. "And what's that?" "A second chance." A deep silence filled the car. Gabriel stared at him, his heart pounding. "I don't understand. You've been struggling, haven't you?" Charles continued. "The debts. The bills. The weight of the world crushing you under its feet." Gabriel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. Charles nodded. "I know what it's like to lose everything, son. I lost my family, my home, my life. I left this world with unfinished business that led me back to you." Gabriel shook his head, confused. "What are you saying?" Charles turned his gaze forward, his voice filled with certainty. "We're almost there." Gabriel looked out at the road ahead. They were pulling into a vast, empty property, a mansion, massive and untouched, standing like a forgotten kingdom in the night. Gabriel's breath hitched. This is your house?" Charles nodded. "It was my home. And now, it's yours." Gabriel blinked. "Wait, what?" Charles reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather envelope. He handed it to Gabriel, his large fingers firm but steady. Gabriel hesitated before taking it, his pulse racing. He flipped open the envelope, and his breath caught in his throat. Property deeds. Bank statements. A letter of transfer. The documents were real. And they all had his name on them. His hands shook. I don't understand. What is this?" "My promise, Gabriel," Charles said. "When you saved my life, I swore to myself that I'd find you one day and return the kindness. I searched for you for years, but I never found you. Death took me before I could fulfill my word. But even in death, I couldn't let go of that promise." Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest. This couldn't be happening. This house, the money. Gabriel's voice was hoarse. "You're just giving it to me?" Charles smiled warmly. "It was never mine to keep. I have no family left, no one to leave it to. But you, Gabriel, you're a good man. A man who gives, even when he has nothing. A man who deserves a fresh start." Gabriel's mind was spinning. This was too much. Too unreal. I can't just take this," he stammered. "It's too much." Charles shook his head. "It's exactly what you need." Gabriel looked at the mansion again. The sheer size of it, the grandeur. It felt like stepping into another world. "But why me?" Gabriel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles placed a strong hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with something deep and knowing. "Because kindness has a way of coming back to us," he said. "Even when we least expect it." Gabriel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. The weight of his debts, his struggles, his worries, it all felt so small now. This wasn't just money. This wasn't just a house. This was a miracle. Tears burned at the edges of Gabriel's eyes, but he blinked them away. He looked at Charles, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something different. Not just a man. Not just a ghost. But a friend. A soul that had come back, not for revenge, not for regret, but for love. Gabriel took a deep breath and gripped the documents in his hands. His life would never be the same again. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Gabriel sat in stunned silence, his hands gripping the documents that had just changed his life forever. The mansion before him seemed like a dream, something so far beyond his reach that even looking at it felt surreal. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Charles. This is real?" Charles chuckled softly. "As real as you and me, son." Gabriel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this." Charles's expression turned firm. "You do. More than you know." Gabriel stared at the papers in his hands. Deeds, legal documents, and bank statements, all with his name on them. He had spent years struggling to make ends meet, constantly living under the weight of debt, but in the span of one night, his entire life had changed. He swallowed hard. "What about you? What happens now?" Charles smiled, his deep eyes reflecting peace. "My time here is almost up." Gabriel felt a lump rise in his throat. "But what does that mean?" Charles looked up at the sky, a quiet sense of acceptance in his gaze. "I held on for as long as I could, waiting for the chance to find you again. I couldn't leave this world knowing my debt to you was unpaid. But now, I can rest." Gabriel clenched his fists, his chest tightening. "But you don't have to go. I mean, maybe there's another way?" Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a good heart, Gabriel. But my journey ends here." A breeze swept through the night, rustling the trees around them. Charles took a step back, his form flickering slightly as if he were fading. Panic shot through Gabriel. "Wait. There's so much I don't understand." Charles raised a hand, stopping him. "No more questions, son. Just one thing I want you to remember." Gabriel swallowed hard, nodding. "Never stop being who you are," Charles said. "The world is full of people who take, who hurt, who turn their backs on others. But you give. Even when you have nothing, you still give." Gabriel's throat tightened. "That kindness brought you here. It gave you a second chance. And I know you'll use it well." Gabriel wiped at his eyes, trying to hold himself together. "I don't know how to thank you." Charles smiled warmly. "You already have." And then, just like that, Charles stepped backward into the night, his figure growing more transparent with each step. The air shimmered around him, a soft glow surrounding his body. Gabriel's breath caught in his throat as he saw Charles give him one last nod, one final look of gratitude, before fading completely. Silence. Gabriel stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Charles had been. His heart pounded, his mind racing to process what had just happened. It was over. Charles was gone. Gabriel let out a shaky breath, looking down at the documents in his hands. He clutched them tightly, realizing what they meant. He was no longer a man drowning in debt. No longer a man barely scraping by. He had been given a new life. A second chance. And he would make the most of it. 1 year later, Gabriel stood on the grand balcony of his mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm hues of gold and orange. The past year had been a whirlwind, one that still felt like a dream. He had paid off all his debts. He had enrolled his daughter in college, giving her the future she had always dreamed of. And for the first time in years, he had found peace. A gentle breeze brushed against his skin, and he closed his eyes, feeling a quiet presence around him. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe, somewhere beyond this world, Charles was still watching over him. Gabriel smiled softly, whispering into the evening air. "Thank you, my friend." And with that, he turned away from the past and stepped forward into the future.